Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We're very excited to be here with the next talk in our lecture series this year. If you're joining us online, we're so happy to have you. And if you're joining us later, watching this on recorded media, thank you for finding us. My name is Pierce Paul Kriesman. It's my pleasure to serve as the Executive Director of the American Center of Research. And we are excited to have with us a guest tonight, Professor Darrell Roll, who's an associate professor at Calvin University. And for most of you who are familiar with Acor or archaeology in Jordan, you will know this site. You will know Al-Jimal. It has been foundational in the growth and development of the field here for many, many, many decades. I will not steal any of Professor Roll's thunder, and we will move straight to it. So, Darrell, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Pierce Paul. Thanks to Acor for inviting me to speak in this important lecture series. My first visit to Jordan was almost 20 years ago, and I can vividly remember attending one of the evening lectures all the way back in 2005, and thinking to myself, someday I'm going to give an Acor lecture. It's taken 20 years, but I'm so pleased to be here. And it's especially meaningful to be here as a professor from Calvin University, an institution with deep ties to Acor since its founding. As Calvin's third professor of archaeology, I'm mindful of following in the footsteps of remarkable figures in Acor's history. Such as Professor Bastian van Elderen of the Calvin Theological Seminary. At the time, we were one institution. Now we're separate institutions. But Professor Bastian van Elderen, one of Acor's 10 founding members, who served as the annual professor director in 1970, and then again from 72 to 74. And my predecessor, Professor Bert de Vries, Van Elderen's former student. De Vries was present at Acor's founding, began his work at Al-Jimal as an ASOR Albright Fellow in 1972 to 73, served as Acor director from 1988 to 91, and remained a cherished member of the Board of Trustees until his passing in 2021. While no one can truly fill their shoes, I want to emphasize that both Calvin University and I are proud of their contributions to Acor and to Jordanian archaeology. We hope to continue their legacy by continuing to support Acor's mission of research excellence, knowledge sharing, and cultural exchange. Thank you, Acor, for all that you do. And before I run out of time, usually I put these at the end of the presentation, but I realized that I often have to cut this part short. I do want to express deep gratitude to all our partners and funders. Over 53 years, this project has relied on many supporters. Some, but not all, represented by logos on the slide. While I can't detail every contribution, I would like to highlight just a few here at the beginning. The Department of Antiquities of Jordan and the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities have been essential from the start, granting fieldwork permits, collaborating on research and site management, and recently overseeing the UNESCO nomination process. Their trust in us to prepare the nomination file has been invaluable. We couldn't do our work without them, and we're deeply grateful for their partnership and the presence here tonight of some members from the ministry and DOA. I also want to thank the Al-Jimal municipality and the Al-Jimal community that have been incredibly hospitable and supportive. They've been wonderful hosts, sharing tea and mensef and their time with us. The mayor and his team have been especially helpful during the UNESCO nomination process, and I'm proud to say, Ana Masaid wa Ibn Al-Jimal. U.S. Aid, SHEP, and the U.S. Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation have also been vital, providing grants and support for training, conservation, and more. And in a time of unfortunate federal budget cuts and uncertainty about future funding, I want to acknowledge their transformative impact. May funding be restored and soon. And we've also entered a new phase of collaboration with UNESCO and ICOMOS, and I thank them for their guidance and rigor during the World Heritage nomination process. We look forward to many more years of working even closer with you. And finally, my time here in Jordan has been made possible by Calvin University, which granted me a sabbatical year, and the Fulbright Commission, which is providing funding and essential logistical support while I'm here in Jordan. Now, this lecture is about Al-Jimal, Jordan's newest UNESCO World Heritage Site. I'm going to provide an overview of the site's history, its cultural significance, and some of the collaborative efforts behind its study, preservation, and promotion. While it's designed as an introduction for those who may be less familiar with Al-Jimal, I'm also going to share some research updates, a bit about ongoing work and future plans. The lecture is going to cover a lot of ground, mostly historical and archaeological in nature, but it won't be exhaustive. Still, I hope there's going to be something here for everyone. But before diving into Al-Jimal, let's briefly explore Jordan's UNESCO World Heritage Sites and Jordan's role in the World Heritage process. To start, here's a question, and I want to hear some answers. Which site do you think was Jordan's first nomination to the World Heritage List? Little boy in the front. Petra. Other people? Thought I heard Petra.
Baptism site.
Baptism site. It was, in fact, Jerusalem, specifically its old city and its walls. And this was inscribed by the World Heritage Committee during its first extraordinary session in 1981, reflecting the Hashemite kingdom's long-standing role as custodian of Jerusalem's holy sites. But now let's turn to those sites that are more firmly here in Jordan. This time last year, Jordan had 6. Can anyone name them all? Wadi Rum? Namadaba? Umm Al-Rasas? Qasr al-Amra? Salt? The baptism site. I think that's all of them. All right, so we have here Petra, Jordan's most famous site and the top tourist destination. This was the Nabataean kingdom's primary capital, and it features also impressive Roman and Byzantine remains. It's Jordan's second largest World Heritage Site by area and was the first to be inscribed in 1985. Second was Qasr al-Amra, Jordan's smallest World Heritage Site, which lies in the eastern desert, also inscribed in 1985. It's a small Umayyad palace renowned for its exceptional early Islamic frescoes. We then have Umm Al-Rasas, inscribed in 2004, located about 30 kilometers southeast of Madaba. It began as a Nabataean settlement, later becoming a Roman fort, and then a Byzantine and Umayyad monastic town. Its highlights include a uniquely intact Byzantine stylite tower and stunning mosaics, such as the Umayyad era pavement in the St. Stephen's Church. We then have Wadi Rum, Jordan's largest World Heritage Site by a lot in terms of size, which was inscribed in 2011 for its cultural and natural significance. The only one in Jordan to be inscribed for not just cultural value, but also natural. Alongside Petra, Wadi Rum has helped to cement southern Jordan as a top tourist destination. And then we have Al-Maktas, or Bethany beyond the Jordan, identified as the baptism site of Jesus by John the Baptist, particularly significant for Christian pilgrims. This was inscribed in 2015. And then Salt. Its late Ottoman urban core was inscribed in 2021 as the place of tolerance and hospitality. And this celebrates the city's intercultural and interfaith harmony, its distinctive architecture, and the cooperative traditions across religions. And finally, on July 27th, 2024, Al-Jimal was officially inscribed as Jordan's 7th UNESCO World Heritage Site and the first in the country's north. While it's smaller than Wadi Rum or Petra, its inscribed area is still substantial. It's about half the size of Jerusalem's old city. and nearly double the size of Umm Al-Jimal. And for another comparison, it's roughly 80% the size of Jerash's visitable area. Now, you have to understand that that's only about 60% of ancient Gerasa, with the others underneath the modern city. But Umm al-Jimal is substantial. It's a big site. So how many of you have visited Umm al-Jimal? All right, that's great. Good. I wish there were more who hadn't. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. Visit it soon. I'll give you a tour. Al-Jimal is one of Jordan's most important and spectacular sites, and I'd argue one of the world's. Now, Al-Jimal is a ruined site with no fully intact ancient structures, but this is part of its charm. Its combination of ruin, preservation, and scale set it apart, evoking mystery and loss while sparking the visitor's imagination. Unlike many other ancient sites, which offer mostly foundations and maybe a few standing structures, Al-Jimal boasts over 170 ruined buildings, many surviving to the second or third story. This level of preservation allows visitors to use the visual evidence of well-preserved structures in order to mentally reconstruct the site in a way that mere foundations can't. The ruins actually constrain and shape the imagination in a reliable, realistic way. And early visitors described Al-Jimal in really romantic terms. Cyril Graham, who visited in 1857, said, "This is perhaps among the most perfect of the old cities which I saw. So perfect was every street, every house, every room, that I could almost have fancied, as I was wandering alone in this city of the dead, seeing all perfect, and yet not hearing a sound, that I had come upon one of those enchanted places that one reads of in the Arabian Nights, where the population of a whole city had been petrified for a century." And Howard Crosby Butler of the Princeton expedition introduced the site in 1913 by saying, "Far out in the desert, in the midst of a rolling plain, beside the dry bed of an ancient stream, there is a deserted city. The walls of the ancient deserted city, its half-ruined gates, the towers and arches of its churches, the 2- and 3-story walls of its mansions, all of basalt, have fallen in ruin. But many others preserve their ancient form in such wonderful completeness that to the traveler approaching them from across the plain, the deserted ruin appears like a living city, all of black, rising from a gray-white sea." Now, while the surrounding land is now more developed, and earthquakes, looting, and time have reduced its preservation, these descriptions still resonate today. I think most of you who visited would probably agree, at least I hope you would. In short, Al-Jimal is spectacular, and it belongs on every must-visit list in Jordan. It offers a uniquely complete ancient town featuring 2 Roman forts, an imperial administrative building, 16 churches, 3 possible mosques, a complex water system with over 30 reservoirs, and at least 150 houses, all enclosed within intact town walls. Yes, it lacks the monumental temples, tombs, theaters, and colonnaded streets that one may encounter at Petra or Jerash. And it doesn't have the kinds of mosaics or frescoes that you'll find at Umm-Rasas, Madaba, or Qasr al-Amra. But where are the houses at these sites? And how did their inhabitants live their daily lives? Only at Al-Jimal can you explore ancient daily life in this region on such a scale. So now, please indulge me as I nerd out for a little while. We're going to dive into Al-Jimal itself focusing on its historical and archaeological significance. And Al-Jimal's location is crucial. Situated in Jordan's far north, just kilometers from the Syrian border, it lies on the southern edge of the Haran, a volcanic basalt plateau formed millions of years ago by eruptions from the now extinct Jebel al-Arab or Jebel al-Druze volcano. The region's abundant basalt shaped a distinctive architectural tradition, particularly during the classical Byzantine and early Islamic periods. And this volcanic stone allowed for incredibly strong and stable structures with unique features, making architecture the most visible aspect of human culture in the Haran. Now, only a small part of this region, the Haran, lies within Jordan, with the rest in southern Syria. And I think this fact is significant for two key reasons. First, it underscores the arbitrariness and relative modernity of current borders. While Al-Jimal is undoubtedly a Jordanian site and ought to be a source of national pride, the people and cultures it represents transcend modern borders, enhancing the site's international significance. And second, alhamdulillah, Al-Jimal lies on the Jordanian side, likely sparing it from significant damage during Syria's recent civil war, which has tragically devastated both modern communities and ancient sites. Even before the war, Al-Jimal was the largest and most complete example of an ancient Haranian settlement. And today, this status is even more vital due to all the damage we see across the border. And while there's evidence of occasional human presence at Al-Jimal during the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, permanent settlement began only in the late 1st century. And the site's occupation spans much of the past 2,000 years, with continuous development through the Nabataean, Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic periods. By the early 800s, it was largely abandoned in terms of permanent settlement, but it saw regular periodic use by nomads before it finally became resettled again in the 20th century. And this modern occupation included brief French and military presence, French and British military presence during disputes over the border between French Mandate Syria and British Mandate Transjordan. The French colonial administration even enacted a practice of forcibly relocating Druze families to the site in an unsuccessful attempt to extend their Syrian territory further south. And later, families from the Bedouin Masaid tribe, who had used Al-Jimal as a seasonal base for decades, settled within the ruins, pitching tents and using the ancient structures as shelters for their flocks. They remained within the site until the 1970s, when the government evicted them to protect the Antiquities. However, they stayed nearby, forming the new village that surrounds the site today. Now, Al-Jimal's origins date to the Nabataean period. And though the Nabataeans are most closely tied to southern Jordan and their capital at Petra, in most people's minds, that's what they think of as Nabatea, right? The Nabataeans' territory was vast. For reasons that are still unclear, in the late 1st century, they established a new, or perhaps a secondary, capital at Busra, or Bastra, as the Romans called it, about 23 kilometers northeast of Al-Jimal in modern-day Syria. And the Nabataean settlement at Al-Jimal was almost certainly linked to this development. This is probably when it begins. Within a few decades, though, the Roman Empire would annex Nabatea, ending its client kingdom status in 106 CE and creating the new Provincia Arabia, or the province of Arabia. They made Bastra the provincial capital and repaved the ancient road connecting Aqaba to Damascus, renaming it the Via Nova Traiana, or Trajan's New Road, which ran several kilometers west of Al-Jimal. And excavations suggest that the early settlement took the form of a village located southeast of the later walled town. So here you can see the early village, and here you see the walled town. The walled town, this is the World Heritage Site. The early village is not part of the World Heritage Site, but it is within the buffer zone. The later town ultimately developed around the Roman military presence, with residents eventually moving the short distance from the village. And in an inscription near Al-Jimal's west, or Commodus Gate, reveals a Roman military presence during the joint reign of the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. This inscription mentions the construction of a vallum, a term often used for linear frontiers like Hadrian's Wall, built between the reigns of Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius. While no such long wall is known in the Syrian or Arabian provinces, the vallum here likely refers to a Roman fort or an outpost at Al-Jimal. And this structure hasn't yet been found, though the Commodus Gate or an earlier version of the gate may have been a part of that structure. Interestingly, Commodus's name is actually not on the inscription. It's missing. It had been chiseled out in antiquity, a practice known as damnatio memoriae, or the condemnation of memory. Commodus faced this fate after his murder in 192. It's not a great ruler. The Senate decreed that his statues be destroyed and his memory erased. This was, however, reversed only a year later by the new emperor, Septimius Severus, who needed the support of Marcus Aurelius's family in order to secure his position. So while we can't be certain that Commodus was originally named in the inscription, the very formulaic nature of Roman inscriptions and the short duration of his damnatio memoriae allow us to reconstruct the missing sections with a great deal of confidence. The inscription was likely created between 176 to 180, possibly tied to Commodus's visit to the eastern provinces in 177, while the erasure of the name almost certainly occurred in 192 or 193 during that brief window when the order was in effect. Then from 235 to 284, the Roman Empire faced a 50-year crisis marked by fragmentation and competing claimants to the throne. One such claimant was Philip the Arab, born in the Haran as Shaba, which he rebuilt and renamed Philippopolis. His rise to power highlights the Haran's significance and challenges Western-centric views of Roman civilization. The crisis would drag on. Gaul and Britannia break away in the northwest, while in the southeast, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra seized the opportunity to establish her own empire, ultimately encompassing Syria, Arabia, Palestina, and Egypt. In 270, she rebelled against Rome, destroying the provincial capital at Bastra, and a meter-thick ash layer at Al-Jimal may also point to a Zenobian attack here too. Her rebellion lasted 4 years until Aurelian, a Roman general turned emperor, defeated her. Now, it's likely in this context, the end of the Zenobian rebellion, that the early castellum was built at Al-Jimal. Though it was probably not, as I said, the first fort at the site. It's just the earliest that we have found so far. Featuring an integrated water system and a large imperial reservoir, this fort is what likely spurred the relocation of the settlement from the earlier village to what became the walled town that we see today. And before we move on from Zenobia, Jamal offers another tangible link. Two funerary inscriptions, one in Greek and the other in Nabataean, for Fear, son of Seleus, the teacher of Gadima or Jadima, king of the Tanukh. Now, Fear is known only from these inscriptions. This is the only evidence left behind of Fear's existence, right? These two inscriptions. Um, uh, but Jadima, king of the Tanukh, he appears in later Arabic sources as an epic pre-Islamic figure. One story describes him allying with Rome against Zenobia. And while some Western scholars had dismissed Jadima as just a legendary figure, these late 3rd century inscriptions from Al-Jimal confirm his existence, and they suggest that the accounts of his role in Zenobia's story may be true. And this could also help to explain why Al-Jimal might have been targeted by Zenobia's army. If its ties to Jadima and the Tanukh would have been known, Zenobia would have attacked the site in order to send a strong message to potential allies of her enemies. But another reason why Zenobia may have targeted Al-Jimal was its proximity and close ties to Basra. Located just 23 kilometers southwest of the capital, the provincial capital, Al-Jimal was right at the heart of the Roman province. And inscriptions from Al-Jimal show that it wasn't just physically close, but it was also the home, or at least the burial place, of 7 buletes, or council members of Bastra. We have Ausos, son of Elados, Ianes, son of Athikos, Alexandros, son of Acidos, Camathos, son of Doros, Nobias, Basos Mayor, and Mayor, the son of Basos. Their tombstones proudly note their status as Bastra's council members, with Basos Mayor and his son Mayor described as either the highest ranking or amongst the most foremost members of Bastra's Boule during their lifetimes. Now, historically, buletes were prominent landowners who served for life, overseeing tax collection, local administration, and public works. And they held significant power until the 3rd century crisis began to lead to a decline in their numbers and authority. So these inscriptions are all tombstones, but they're all found reused in secondary context in houses in the Byzantine period. They likely date to the 2nd, 3rd, or early 4th century, and probably the earlier part of that span. And what's particularly important is that they reveal that Al-Jimal wasn't just a rural settlement or small town, but it was a place with strong ties to the provincial capital, where at least some residents played major roles in that capital's local administration. And we still don't fully understand the full details of Al-Jimal's layout or activities during the 4th and 5th centuries, because much of the evidence from this period is built over in later centuries and is often found recycled or buried beneath the substantial town that developed from the late 5th century onward. We do know, though, that the early castellum, that Roman fort built after the 3rd century crisis, housed a military garrison throughout the 4th century, and inscriptions are again really crucial here. 3 Latin inscriptions reused in later Byzantine construction reveal that the 9th Dalmatian cavalry garrisoned the fort during the late 4th century under the governor Flavius Maximinus. And these inscriptions record military projects, including the building of 2 observation towers, one dated quite precisely to 368, and a burgess dated to 371. Now, these structures may have been modifications to the early castellum or completely new structures, possibly located close to where their stones were reused at the town's northeast and southeast corners and in the area of the Byzantine cathedral, suggesting that maybe the settlement had begun to expand around the fort in those directions, and that these were necessary additions to protect the site. Now, another inscription in Greek and found in a house courtyard records the construction of a fort under the Duke Flavius Pelagius Antipatros in 412 or 413. And this likely refers to the barracks, which is unfortunately located 200 meters southeast of the inscription's find spot. Unlike earlier inscriptions, though, this one features clear Christian imagery, including crosses, reflecting the growing Christian identity within the late Roman military. And the barracks tower itself is adorned with copious Christian symbols, including machicolations naming the four archangels, Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, and Uriel, and inscriptions like Emmanuel, a cross with the words, "This sign triumphs and helps," and prayers such as, "Lord God, judge those who wrong us and wage war against them with your power." This shift highlights Christianity's transformation from a persecuted religion to the official faith of the empire under Theodosius I in 380 CE. And I think it's notable that we have these 368, 371 inscriptions from the Roman military that have no mention of Christianity or any religion whatsoever. But then the very next ones that we've got are clearly talking about Christianity. The making of Christianity, the official religion, did have quick impacts on the material culture that we see left behind by the Roman military. Now, we also know, though, that Christians existed across the Roman world before the faith was legalized under the 313 Edict of Milan. And more locally, historical records show that two important church councils, the councils of Arabia, took place at nearby Bastra in 246 and 247, despite the fact that Christianity was still technically illegal at the time. It is therefore possible that Christians may have lived at Al-Jimal during this time or even earlier. And the New Testament mentions that the Apostle Paul spent 3 years in Arabia after his conversion. We've often thought that the Arabia, particularly scholars from the West, the Arabia that Paul spent his time at, we think about the Saudi Arabia, we think about the Gulf states, but Basra, 23 kilometers away, was the capital of Arabia. All right, so he very well could have been in this area. Now, the earliest definitive evidence for Christianity in a Christian community at Al-Jimal, though, comes from an inscription found at the Julianos Church, initially interpreted as a dedication for the church's construction. Its date, written 239, which isn't 239 AD. That system didn't exist at the time. It likely corresponds to 344, 345 AD or CE, using the common practice within the region at that time to date things from the establishment of Bastra as the provincial capital. And this inscription, once made during the first half of the 20th century, Al-Jimal rather famous as the site of what some people called the oldest church in the world with a dated inscription. Scholars later questioned this interpretation, suggesting that the inscription was actually a reused tombstone and that the church was built later. And this is now the standard view. The Julianos Church almost certainly was not built before the end of the, was not built until at least the late 5th, if not into the early 6th century, like most of the other churches at Al-Jimal. But the inscription, it is dated, and that inscription specifically mentions the tomb of Julianos, the 12-year-old son of Agathos, the presbyter or priest, built near the edge of the cemetery of the community of the people of Christ. All right. This doesn't date the church to the mid-4th century, but it confirms that a Christian community existed at Al-Jimal in the decades after legalization, but before the state promotion of the faith. Though we don't know where they worshiped, Agathos would have been among the clergy leading this community. And Al-Jimal saw explosive growth in the Byzantine 6th century, evolving into the town that's visible today. It developed organically around earlier structures, such as the Roman Praetorium, the early Castellum, and the barracks. We had in this period a town wall added, most of the houses and churches, and an expansion of the water system that had originally been developed by the Nabataeans and the Roman military. And in this period, distinct neighborhoods formed in the north, in the southeast, and in the southwest, with a large open area featuring key structures like the West Church, the West Commodus Gate, the Cathedral, the Praetorium, the Numerianos Church, and the barracks, marking what is otherwise a quite empty space. And if you look here on the map, I'm talking about this space here. You've got the southwest neighborhood, the southeast neighborhood, and the north neighborhood. Why this space in the middle, though, remained open, unlike the densely packed neighborhoods, is unclear. There is some evidence, I've seen it on the ground, that there are some earlier structures in this area, probably earlier structures, pre-Byzantine structures. I'd love to excavate and do some geophysics there, and we have plans for that in the coming years. But one intriguing hypothesis was proposed by the late Bob Kokenauer, is that this open space was intentional. And Kokenauer was Acor's board president during Bert de Vries' tenure as director. He was also supervisor of excavations at Al-Jimal's Northeast Church. And he suggested that the site may have come under Ghassanid control. And this Christian Arab tribe, allied with the Byzantine Empire as federati, administered parts of Palestine, Syria, and Arabia on behalf of the Byzantine Empire, acting as a buffer against the Sassanid Persians. While there's no definitive evidence of the Ghassanid presence at Al-Jimal, Kokenauer proposed that the open space could have served as a base for these nomadic peoples who might have pitched their tents there while using the Praetorium as a base of administration and worshiping in the cathedral. We can't confirm this hypothesis yet, but it's an intriguing possibility that aligns with what we know about Ghassanid regional administrative patterns and could help to explain the town's layout. But whether or not the Ghassanids were directly involved with Al-Jimal, the site was shaped by broader 6th century Byzantine developments, particularly the Emperor Justinian's support for church construction. Nearly all of the 16 churches date to the period 530 to 60, right during Justinian's reign, based on pottery readings and, where we've been able to do it, radiocarbon dating of charcoal that's embedded in mortar plasters. And this high number of churches raises questions. In Jordan, only Ar-Rasas has a similar concentration. And that's explained by its monastic setting. We know there was a monastic, Ar-Rasas was a monastic site. Al-Jimal, however, appears to have been a simple town with no clear monastic presence. They could have been there, but there's nothing at Al-Jimal that's definitive evidence for a monastery or even a single monk. Butler, Howard Crosby Butler, had suggested that the barracks might have been converted into a monastery later. It's just a suggestion. And the Numerianos Church at the site has rooms around a water reservoir resembling monastic cloisters. but no inscriptions or artifacts can confirm that monks lived there. And when we think about the churches, they can be categorized in all sorts of different ways. 14 are inside the town walls, 2 are outside. 9 are basilicas with the central nave and side aisles, and 7 are hall churches with just the nave and no aisles. 12 appear to be accessible publicly from the streets, while 3 or 4 you could only access them from entering private space first. 6 are freestanding, while 10 are embedded, physically connected to adjacent, mostly domestic architecture. And notably, the south hall of the double church isn't Byzantine. It's actually Umayyad, built in the Umayyad period, showing Christianity's continuation under early Islamic rule. And in recent years, Al-Jimal's churches and their role in daily life have become a major focus of our fieldwork and research. And as I compiled information on Al-Jimal's churches for a comprehensive catalog and a forthcoming book, I was surprised to find an unpublished manuscript in our project archives, written by Bob Kokenauer in the mid-1980s. And reading it, along with his correspondent with Bert de Vries, I understand why it wasn't included in the project's first major volume, but it has nevertheless been invaluable. There's a lot of really interesting ideas, some ways of thinking about things that I hadn't thought of before. Now, I've already mentioned that Kokenauer hypothesized about the Ghassanids using the open space, and he does so in this paper. But he also organizes Al-Jimal's churches into a 6-category typology, which I'm just going to briefly review here. The first category are parish churches. He puts here the northwest, the northeast, the southeast, and the southwest churches, all of which are in the town's 4 corners, as well as the double church. All these churches have public access points, with maybe one exception, with the corner churches likely serving their respective town quarters. And Kokenauer aligns with Howard Crosby Butler, who thought that the double church was probably a parish church, simply because it's embedded within a neighborhood and it doesn't really neatly fall into another category. However, we're not actually sure that the double church was publicly accessible. Excavation around the northern basilica's doorway would help to clarify this. In the second category are what Kokenauer calls monastic churches. I'm not sure this category exists, but I'm open to the possibility, particularly with one church. He assigns the freestanding Numerianos church, which I might be inclined to agree with, and the East Church within the ruins of the early Castellum. Now, Butler had previously suggested that the barracks chapel had a monastic function, claiming that the military structure was later converted, but we lack compelling evidence for this. And Bert's feedback to Kokenauer casts significant doubt on classifying the East Church as monastic, and I agree, the evidence is pretty weak. The Numerianos Church is a pretty strong candidate. Given its attached cells or potential cloisters north of the basilica, the fact that it's freestanding and in that open space maybe as well. Still, the argument relies on architectural style, with no strong small finds and no inscriptions that could be used to confirm a monastic role. There are inscriptions, lots of inscriptions from this church, but nothing that tells us it's a monastery. The third category is a single military church attached to the later Roman castellum or barracks, as Butler called it. And if Butler's theory about its conversion into a monastery is incorrect, it's really reasonable to assume that the chapel served the religious needs of the small garrison in the early Byzantine town. The fourth category are family or clan churches, including the Julianos, the Claudianos, and the Masecos churches, each with entrances accessible only from within attached domestic structures or courtyards, suggesting these were entirely for private individual family uses. Kokenauer didn't know about the newly discovered House 95 Chapel or the Miriam Church, as Muafak Hazza calls it, based on an inscription, but its private access points clearly place it in this category. The fifth category are funerary churches, the West Church and the East Chapel, the two located outside of the town walls. Kokenauer suggests that the East Chapel served this function because it was closely located near the eastern and southern cemeteries, while the West Church does have a large chamber tomb just west of its entrance. Now, we've done recent excavations in the last few years at and near the West Church, but these haven't provided any additional evidence to support or reject a funerary function. Though I still think that's probably the reason why that church existed. And the final category are nomadic, tribal, or ruling authority churches. Kokenauer confidently assigned the cathedral to this category, and this is part of his view about the Ghassanids inhabiting that open space, where they would camp in that open space when they visited the site, use the cathedral as the ruling place of worship, and do their business of administrating the town from the praetorium. So what can we make of this typology? Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm grateful for Kokenauer's contributions and all the questions that this has raised. It really has caused me to think a lot about the churches in ways that I never did before. We may ultimately propose a simpler typology. And it's important to recognize that typologies are tools. They're intellectual tools to make sense of complex realities. No single typology needs to dominate. Multiple, even competing ones, can help in our interrogation of the evidence. And we're going to continue to evaluate these ideas and to develop our own as we build a robust, evidence-driven synthesis of religion and society at this remarkable site. Now, one of my recent research avenues just developed in the last couple of months. Just before Christmas, I had a detached retina, and so I've been unable to do a number of things that I would like to do. My vision has been impaired, but I have been able to read. And so I've been reading this book by Blake Laerle. It's called Christians at Home, John Chrysostom and Domestic Rituals in 4th Century Antioch. This work explores the teachings of John Chrysostom, a towering figure in the Orthodox Church, who shaped the divine liturgy that's still central to Orthodox worship today. And his ideas almost certainly influenced Byzantine Christians, including those at Al-Jimal, making his efforts to connect Christian teachings with everyday domestic and social life particularly relevant as we consider the role of Byzantine Christianity in the daily life of Al-Jimal's residents. Now, the book focuses on Chrysostom's impassioned sermons, urging Christians to make your house a church. And this wasn't just a metaphor. He envisioned a program of domestic rituals to transform homes into sacred spaces. Rooted in scripture and early Christian practices, his teachings emphasized integrating worship into daily life, ethical living, and hospitality. And central to the vision was the idea that worship shouldn't be confined to church buildings. He encouraged families to engage in morning and evening prayers, singing psalms, reciting scriptural refrains like, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." These practices weren't just for adults. And Chrysostom urged parents to involve their children, even waking them up at night to pray, so that your house may become altogether a church during the night. And this rhythm of prayer and scripture was meant to sanctify the home, making it a place of continual worship. And hospitality was another key element. Chrysostom held up Priscilla and Aquila, New Testament tent makers, as models of Christian hospitality. Despite their modest means, they opened their homes to strangers, effectively making their houses a church, according to Chrysostom. And he urged his congregants to follow their example, using their tables not just for meals, but for spiritual fellowship. After church, he said, families should set out a double table, one of food and the other of listening, where the father would recount the sermon, the mother would learn, and even servants could listen. And the practice was designed to reinforce the home as a place of spiritual instruction and communal worship. And to further embed scripture in daily life, Chrysostom recommended inscribing ethical verses on walls and doors. For example, he suggested engraving Ecclesiastes 1:2, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, or a personalized version of Luke 6:26, alas for us when all people speak well of us, around the houses. These inscriptions weren't meant to ward off evil or to bring magical blessings, but to serve as constant reminders of Christian values, particularly the dangers of vanity and the importance of humility. Seeing these words daily, Chrysostom believed, would help restrain desires for wealth and honor, fostering ethical, community-minded behavior. And he also encouraged congregants to extend hospitality to the poor, suggesting that they set aside a room for guests in need. And for those who couldn't spare an entire room, he proposed making space in the lower levels of the house. And the houses he describes are precisely those we see at Al-Jimal, these multi-story homes. Make a place in the lower levels of the house where your slaves and animals are kept. Use this, set this aside, part of it, for guests as a practice of hospitality. And this was designed to mirror the church's role in sheltering the vulnerable and reinforcing the home as a place of charity and compassion. Now, notably, Chrysostom's recommendations weren't limited to the elite. He envisioned a program adaptable to all social and economic levels. For example, he encouraged simple graffiti-like inscriptions on walls and doors, which anyone could create with charcoal or a nail. These markings, often featuring crosses or scriptural phrases, were rough but accessible reminders of faith. And he even suggested writing the name of the Lord in public spaces, like the marketplace, blurring the line between private and public devotion. In summary, I just skipped a part here, Chrysostom's call to make your house a church was a comprehensive program of domestic rituals designed to transform everyday life into an act of worship. Through prayer, scripture, hospitality, and ethical reflection, he believed Christians could create sacred spaces in their homes, drawing God to dwell among them. His teachings were ambitious yet flexible and accessible to all social and economic levels. By turning their houses into churches, Chrysostom's Byzantine Christians weren't just sanctifying their homes, they were participating in a broader transformation of society, radiating outward from the individual to the city and beyond. And with 150 houses identified at Al-Jimal, far more than most sites from classical or late antiquity, we can compare Chrysostom's vision to the site's domestic archaeology. While we haven't found the tables, beds, or alms boxes that he specifically describes, many residents did adorn their homes with Christian symbols and phrases. We have at least 25 distinctively Christian inscriptions known from the site, along with numerous sculpted or incised crosses that are still being cataloged. Some of these appear in churches and the barracks. And I'm reminded of, he said, write the name of God in the marketplace. Well, we saw the name of God, Emmanuel, marked on the barracks tower. Is this an example as well? So we've got some examples, and here we have in House 7 an arch with a sculpted cross medallion, the Greek letters Alpha and Omega, symbolizing Jesus as the beginning and the end. And then we've got these simpler examples, the One God inscription in House 6 with the Greek cross and a square, the names of the owners, Yanis, Sozana, and Kaiumos in houses 40 and 55. And these latter inscriptions are much cruder than those that we find in the churches or what we see in House 7. And I think that these reflect really well the kind of graffiti-like markings that Chrysostom encouraged his congregants to make in their homes. There are many more such crosses and inscriptions existing within the houses of Al-Jimal. So when you visit, pay attention to the doorways and entrances. That's where you're usually going to find these. Now, I'm wrapping up. I hope you're starting to see just how important Al-Jimal is. We've only scratched the surface in this lecture. I would like to take a quick minute to highlight the site's possible mosques, including House 53, remodeled, which was remodeled and saw the addition of a minaret, but in the middle or late Islamic period. So probably a visiting kind of nomadic, a temporary, right, or periodically used mosque, one rather than one that was routinely used. And also, Al-Jimal is the most significant site in northern Jordan for inscriptions, with over 500 Greek and Latin inscriptions, plus dozens in Nabataean, Safavidic, and Arabic. These texts give voice to the people who lived there. They reveal the site's ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity over centuries, including the enduring importance of Nabataean and Greek bilingualism. In fact, Al-Jimal accounts for over 70% of all the known inscriptions in Northeast Jordan. Many are still available or visible in the site structures, in the on-site museum, or in the outdoor inscriptions garden. And now, as we near the conclusion, I want to once again thank the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, the Department of Antiquities, the community of Al-Jimal, and the municipality, as well as Calvin University for sticking with this work for the past 53 years. I wasn't even born when Bert started his work at Al-Jimal, but it's such a great honor to be a part of continuing this legacy of collaboration. And over the years, the people of Jordan and of Al-Jimal have opened their doors and their hearts to hundreds of Al-Jimal archaeological project teams across 23 field seasons and many other years of work by our local team, with frequent visit by project directors, and maybe just a couple, not an official field season, but work constantly being done. And while I have focused on Al-Jimal's ancient past tonight, a major priority for archaeologists, by the way, we don't just work for a love of history. We believe that the past matters today. It matters to foreign team members like myself. It matters to the global academic community, but even more so, it matters to the people of Al-Jimal, to the people of Jordan, and the people of the wider Middle East. Now, I joined the project for two reasons. One, I fell in love with the site the moment I arrived. All right. And second, I was inspired by Bert de Vries's community archaeology approach. Now, at Calvin University, our mission is to equip students to think deeply, act justly, and live wholeheartedly as agents of renewal in the world. And Bert embodied this at Al-Jimal, balancing the exploration and protection of antiquities with efforts to support human connections and the flourishing of the local community. While I don't have time to share all the stories of how this has been achieved, all sorts of members of our team can tell those stories better than I, but I'm happy to discuss those. Now, our biggest recent task, and I am nearly finished, was developing the site's UNESCO World Heritage nomination file. It was a long, challenging process, and tensions flared at times. Losing Bert was a blow. And no one has fully filled his role. But alhamdulillah, we succeeded. While UNESCO didn't agree with all our recommended nomination criteria, I still think they're wrong. It only takes one, all right? We nominated it for 3 criteria. All right, they said only one counts, but that's all we needed. We made a strong case, working as one team to complete and support the file through the evaluation process. And even though it was long and arduous, there were even moments when it was kind of fun. So thanks to all who were involved in that. Now, the work continues with exciting plans ahead. We're collaborating with the ministry and department to establish committees that are outlined in the site management plan. And I've got the nomination file and site management plan here. If people want to take a look at this. We have now gotten approval for designs for a new on-site ticket office. Hopefully that'll happen soon. We will be conducting conservation work at the West Church this summer. And we're also developing one of my big projects while I'm here as a Fulbright scholar is a digital archive using the Arches data platform. Which is going to serve as more than just an archive. It's designed for ongoing site management, updated with every field activity and every conservation report, and actively used to monitor and evaluate the site on an ongoing basis. And a local team is currently documenting each ancient structure, stone by stone, in 2D and 3D. And next month, I'll be adding ground-based 3D LiDAR scans to this. As I said, I had my eye surgery that kind of put me away from doing the work, but next month we get to it. Now, this affordable, repeatable method aims to create the most comprehensive digital documentation of any site in Jordan that's on this scale, with plans to share the methods so that it can be expanded to be used at other sites in collaboration with the Department of Antiquities. The missing piece is a new aerial survey using a drone for sub-centimeter topographical modeling. We hope to use aerial LiDAR to complement all of our ground-based efforts, but drone flights in Jordan, they're challenging, especially at Al-Jimal, with our sensitive location near the Syrian border, the Zaatari refugee camp, and the major Air Force base. In fact, a drone commissioned by the municipality last summer was brought down by the Air Force. They arrived an hour after their scheduled time, which is the reason, but it's difficult. So we are hopeful that our UNESCO status and support from our colleagues in the Department of Antiquities and the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities will help us to secure the approval to make this crucial work happen. So there's so much more that I want to say. But I'm out of time. I'm happy to continue the conversation with anyone that wants to know more. I am living in Jordan until the beginning of July. So if you're here and you want to talk more about Al-Jimal, let me know. Also, if you haven't been to Al-Jimal before, or it's been a while since you visited, please contact me or Samer Al-Sarur, our local tour guide, to arrange an expert guided tour and to experience Al-Jimal's amazing hospitality. Ahlan wa sahlan wa shukran jazilan.
Thank you so very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us again. I think we'll take question and answers to the reception. So for all of you who have joined us online, whether it's today live or sometime later, we're so very grateful that you've been able to share this with us. And for everybody here in person, thank you. And just let's head to the next room over and we can continue his questioning. So.